Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. As promised, this is the most boring lecture of all today. No, it's hopefully not that boring, but it's a lecture that engineers or persons from neuroscience or computer science or whatever, let's say nobody except law persons might be really interested in that. But it's very important. It's about the regulatory affairs, and that means about the question, what do we have to consider that we are on the safe side and we are not asked to go into prison if something goes wrong. And therefore, this is probably a motivation to listen and to make your mind. I was very astonished when I tried to update the slides. I thought, well, this is really old stuff I've on there, and I checked it up, but there's still nothing really new from the World Health Organization over the last 15 years. So the regulations or the ideas that the World Health Organization has spread are now settled for 1.5 decades. So therefore, I point to new laws and directives that are around, that are still in a transition phase, but the general idea worldwide is still the same. Like with Ohm's law, you doesn't make a difference if you cite the original one or a latest publication from a week ago. Ohm's law is Ohm's law, right? So, approval of medical devices. This is something that gets more and more interesting for a larger population of engineers and computer scientists, since there are more and more apps for smartphones and whatever. And as we will see later on, there is a difference if you just do it because you want to have something fancy on your smartphone that does something with your human data, or if you want to use this in the context, let's say, of diagnosis or treatment or whatever. And this World Health Organization report from 2003, and I have the link where you can get the whole report for free as PDF download at the very last slide. This has been published around 2003, and since then, the numbers of the world market of medical devices is growing, on average by 5% per year, no matter if there is an economic crisis or not. That was really fascinating for me when all the other markets 10 years ago, whatever, dropped by 10% or even more, medical devices were still rock solid, 4% growth rate, 5% growth rate. So if you want to be a bit sarcastic, it's similar to the market of undertakers. So people always die, people get always sick, so you're more or less on the safe side. Key players are the US, Japan and the European Union, where Germany is still very strong so far in the European Union. If we now want to see which regulations we should follow, I think a good idea could be first to find out what a medical device is. Otherwise, we might apply rules and regulations to devices that are no medical device. So it's really about the definition. What is a medical device? What does that mean? What does safety mean, if we talk about safety in that context? And what regulations do we have worldwide, just as a kind of overview? What is around there? What is included there? And then at the next step to look a little bit more in detail in European legislation. And the reason for that is that I'm more familiar with the European legislation than with others. So I can tell you more details in that context, but having the idea of that set of rules and regulations, it helps you to understand even the other approaches, except the approach of Japan. When you talk to legal bodies, they say you should hire a person from Japan to approve a product in Japan. Otherwise, you will not understand what they are asking for. So there seems to be a different philosophy there. The philosophy of the rest of the world is similar to the ones either in Europe or in the US. All right. So what is a medical device? I mean, I could now ask you, what do you know? What medical devices you know? And you will tell me a lot of things, and then we could sit together and find out, are there commons? Is there an exclusion or whatever? And normally, what persons do, and I'm one of those persons, if I have no clue, I ask Google first. And if you type in medical device, I'm pretty sure if you would type it in now, the hits would be more, but well, it was about 10 millions and about 1 million pictures, so you find a lot of stuff and you never know if this is wrong or right. Wikipedia tells you a medical device is an object which is useful for diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. And this is very typical for Wikipedia. It's not wrong, but the question is, does it really help? And is it really liable in the context of laws? Because this is a very colloquial description, and in law science you need a lot of details that a description is really legally binding and you can sue another person if something goes wrong, right? And then I thought, well, this course is about biomedical microdevices, and when I typed that in, I found a lot of hits of journals and workshops and scientific publications. That's cool, but this does not seem to be legally binding. So let's look into medical device. Examples, I browsed through the pictures. So an X-ray machine is a medical device. An artificial joint like a hip prosthesis is a medical device. A thermometer is a medical device. If you want to sell that to kids, you probably put in some gifts in there that kids are so excited that parents cannot say no, right? So this is all a medical device, but how can you describe that in a way that you do not have a catalog of 2,000 pages that lists all the examples? So what has been done in those contexts, and not only in medical devices, but in many other technical descriptions, is that people sit together. This could either be in an international standardization organization where stakeholders from different companies, from governments, from other interest groups sit together and try to define something. And if they do, and do it on a very large basis, this is quite often done in global harmonization task force. And you can imagine this is not the most exciting job one could imagine, because you're sitting there and you're arguing on details. And there have been several international classification systems, and all those systems must be in accordance with the national understanding of the national laws. This is really difficult, because if you do something wrong in a certain country, you are sued in that country, in most cases. If it's not the Human Rights Court in La Hague, then it's mainly the local court. And this would mean all the description must be in accordance with all those laws that are around there. And if you have a different understanding of laws, there are quite some differences, for example, between Germany and the United Kingdom in some basic definitions, then you have to see how to harmonize that, and that takes ages. And at least they could agree that all these endeavors to harmonize the description should be with the intention to assure patient safety, to have a comparability of reports. If somebody says, oh, this does harm to a patient, that you have a report where you can understand what the report reports about, and to identify adverse incidents. And that will mean, first of all, to define what is an adverse incident. Yeah? So there was tons of papers. And then this very handy definition came out. And this is what you have to go through if you dive into laws or into standards. And I don't want to read that as a whole, but I want to guide you through. First of all, those definitions always starts with a purpose. What is that text good for? So, and that means here they describe what a medical device could be. And for all of us, one of the important thing is that software is included as medical device. That means if you program an app for a medical device, this has to be checked against all the laws of medical devices. And therefore you find sometimes really awkward descriptions of apps on your smartphone where you think, oh, this looks like a medical app, like investigating the depth of your sleep, but then it's called something different, or investigating your heartbeat and your activity, and then it's an activity monitor, because activity monitoring as such is probably not a medical application. And then you find a detour that you don't have to certify your app according to the medical device regulation. We have then, after that, purpose, and this, well, software is important, and for human beings is important. If you develop an app or a device that is good for maintaining the life of your dog, might be a cash cow, something like this, but it's not a medical device, because medical devices are for humans. Right? So it sounds a bit stupid, but that's important with liability issues. And in those texts, we have then inclusion criteria. What is that medical device good for? For the purpose is more, how does it look like, or what is it? What is it good for? And we find diagnosis, treatment, and rehabilitation. And we find supporting of sustaining life, control of conception, and also the disinfection, so to make things clean. After the inclusion criteria, we find exclusion criteria. What is not a medical device? And a medical device is not a medical device. Exclusion criteria here is mainly to pharmaceuticals. This is a different set of laws that applies to pharmaceuticals. And in some cases it's really hard. If you imagine you would have, for example, a cardiac pacemaker at which the electrode is covered with drugs to tailor the reaction after implantation. Then you have to define if the drug application is the primary intended use or the electrical stimulation of the heart. If it's the electrical stimulation of the heart, then you are fine, you're in the medical device regulation, and the dosage of pharmaceuticals is just a side effect. It's the other way around. If your primary intended use is the delivery of drugs, and you need a technical shuttle for that, then the whole system is in the pharmaceutical law set. So this is what, and in rare cases you have to take both. Yeah.
Like the one that you put in the tooth device. What is pharmaceutical or medical device?
So medical device is pharmaceutical is if the primary, that's here, if the primary intended action is pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic, then it's a pharmaceutical. If it's a physical interaction, and electrical current is physical, then it's a medical device.
The example that you gave us for the two,
For the,
for the drugs,
yeah,
we say it's pharmaceutical because
yeah, but if you take a pacemaker with a drug,
not the two, the drugs that are provided by the
by a tooth implant. Well, for those who don't remember, there are implants that look like teeth and they give drugs. There's one in the back. The reservoir has to. The tricky thing is you have the reservoir and you have the drugs. So the reservoir have to fulfill the essential requirements of the medical device regulation, and then the drugs have to be tested against the pharmaceutical things. Because that's a kind of two-component thing. That's, I would say, the worst case. Then you have to fulfill both tracks of regulations. There are others, like those cardiac pacemakers, where, of course, the drugs have to undergo all the drug testing. But if you would take a drug that is already approved and you put it on, then you can already tick the boxes that this has been proven. So, this is not the first page you find in such a law text. This is probably page 10 or something like that. Yeah.
Can you please explain the difference between implant and in vitro reagent?
Implant, yeah, I can. Difference between implant and in vitro. In vitro means in the glass, so it's outside the body. And in vitro diagnostics, which you might refer to, is a device where you take a sample out of the body, like a droplet of blood, and investigate that droplet of blood outside the body in a device. So the device as such is not in contact with parts of the body when the investigation takes place. In implants, a medical device is put into the body with the primary intention to stay there. It's all a bit fishy for the beginning, because a monitoring device that is, for example, an endoscope, which you put in the body for, let's say, 20 minutes, yeah, and put it out again, is not an implant, because the intention is to take it out again, yeah, and so it's a bit tricky, and there are no strict borders, but you can argue in one direction or the other, and the tests that you have to conduct are a bit different. So it's always then your personal negotiation with a legal entity, if the legal entity follows your chain of arguments in that direction or in the other one. And therefore, it's a bit confusing. It really takes a certain time that you understand what this text means and that you understand which options you have. It's not only the meaning, it's also the options. Should I use this or that, or how to proceed the next steps there? And to understand that, we have really technical terms here. Even words that you use in a certain context in your colloquial language might have a certain restricted meaning in that legal context, because all those terms are legally binding. And therefore you have about 5 to 10 pages where you find descriptions. A person is a human being with a assigned set of legal responsibilities and duties, or something like that. Yeah, and those technical terms are, for example, manufacturer, distributor, vendor. There's a very detailed description what that means. So if you manufacture something and you give it to another company that puts a logo on it and says, I did that, then the other company is in legal terms the manufacturer and not you. And this is all described in the first 5 to 10 pages of those documents. So not really fun to go through, but if you know what you expect, it's better. And then there are some additional terms that are then also described. It's the same if you make contracts between companies. Then you have those contracts, and the first 2 pages or 3 pages are definitions, what party A means and party B means, and what selling means, and so it's really different from engineering. So that's of the description. And then it comes to safety. I think we all agree. They say, well, if I sell something as medical device, it should be safe. But what does safe mean, right? So first of all, the most important sentence according to that World Health Organization document is that perfect safety cannot be guaranteed. That means it's not 100% safe or not. It's the outcome of a very sophisticated risk management system. And that means, can I imagine something where it goes wrong? So failure cause. How often might this occur? How serious is that? And can I detect that? Detection thing has been hidden a little bit, but the occurrence rate and the severity are things that go into risk management system. And then, of course, you have to decide, can I take measures? Best is from the constructional side to prevent that risk. And this always is aligned with the device performance and the effectiveness and the intended use. If I have, for example, a defibrillator, so to apply an electric shock to a person who is more or less dead, then the risk of applying so much energy is really high. But the benefit is also high. Either you stay dead or you get reanimated and you live again. That's the same stupid things that persons who have been reanimated, that means they have been dead and they're now alive again, that they sue the paramedics because they have a broken rib. I mean, if I can decide between staying dead and having a broken rib, I think I would prefer to have a broken rib. Right, so, but this is all about that risk-benefit ratio, right? That you have to clearly describe there. And having said this, you have to deliver safety over the lifespan of a medical device. If you have a disposable where the expected lifetime is 10 hours, then you are much more on an easy side than having an implant which should last for 30 years. Then it's much harder to predict the lifetime over 30 years. I mean, life prediction of 5 hours or 10 minutes is easier. You can try it out before. You cannot try it out with an implant that is expected to live 30 years. If you would set up a company and try out 100 implants or 1,000 implants for 30 years in your lab before you go to the market, you're already bankrupt, right? So you have to do some prediction. This is what my colleague Jürgen Wilde does in his quality management lecture, for example, to give you ideas how to do lifetime prediction of technical devices. And this safety should be shared responsibility between all the persons who are in that chain from the idea to the use. And we have to take care. I will point that out later on. If I say use, I do not mean the patient. That's another important thing. If we talk about medical devices, the patient is in most cases not the user. It's the healthcare professional. So if you get a hip implant, of course you use that, but the last person being responsible for that is you. Because you don't normally not implant your hip implant into your body by yourself. This is done by the orthopedic surgeon. So in legal terms, this orthopedic surgeon is the user who takes the hip implant from the manufacturer or the distributor and implants it into your bone. And therefore we have to check it out who is really meant in legal terms as the user of such a device. And we have to cover all the lifespan phases of a medical device, and that goes from the conception and development up to the disposal. And there have been times in the mid-1980s where nuclear energy was really popular, where there have been a cardiac pacemaker with a nuclear battery. Yeah. Developed in Russia. And you can imagine that disposal of those persons who die is really an issue. You cannot just burn them and make a radioactive cardiac pacemaker explode in that chamber, you know? That means you really have to take safety measures. Is an implant pass enough, or should you have whatever? I don't know. A beeper inside when the device discovers that the patient is dead, that the implant starts to beep until it is explanted, or whatever. I have only stupid ideas about that. But you really have to take care about the disposal of those things, that you do not harm a third person by those devices. Here we're now going through the different blocks, and you can read that later on by yourself. So when we do development and design of things, we should have a certain knowledge about that, and this must be documented, and you have to prove that your design is adequate so that it fulfills the intended use of the device. In the manufacturing, you need certain boundary conditions, and these boundary conditions quite often means a quality management system that you have to prove that the persons who manufacture are educated enough to do that you have no dirt, no germs flying around in your labs, that everything is then as clean as possible at the end of the process. And good manufacturing practice is a technical term that ensures all the boundary conditions that you have to fulfill. Then packaging and labeling comes. First of all, packaging, that you keep a clean or sterile product clean or sterile, that it stays clean and sterile when you ship it from A to B, and you normally don't have a person sitting on a horse having one device riding from your manufacturing facility to another place, but you package those things, you put one over the other, you stack them, so you have to ensure that the lowest device does not get crushed by all the others being on top of that. You might take ships or airplanes to bring products from place A to B, and this means they must be protected against salt water if you have a ship, and they must be you must check that they can withstand the temperature changes when you put them in the plane, because the trunk of the plane is not heated, and that means it might go from plus 40 degrees C if you just refuel your airplane in Dubai, to minus 30, 40 something if you're at 30,000 feet flying on intercontinental routes. So this is really something, it took us 2 years, stupid stuff, before we discovered the old, you might all know that, but you might forget it, that water expands, and the largest expansion of water is at plus 4 degrees C. Yeah, you remember there was something like this, biology, fish survive in the lowest part of the lake because water at 4 degrees C is the heaviest one and sinks to the ground and has the largest expansion. This also happens with humidity in air if you have it in tiny little polymer devices. And if you ship them with an airplane over the ocean, they get warm, they get cold, water condenses, then it expands, and it completely destroys thin film metallization that is in those polymer devices. The easiest thing is to put some silica pearls in, you know them if you buy packages or shoes, you have those small bags. You can do this also with medical devices. That took us 4 years. We had much more fun with insulating containers, with aluminum foil, putting our stuff in, temperature loggers, a lot of straps around them. They perfectly looked like bombs, right? Having a temperature logger and a box and something in there and then some wires was really cool to see. Box, when we got the temperature logger back, was over the Easter vacations, went from Frankfurt airport, box was open, people looked in, oh, just crappy stuff, closed the box, sent it to Canada. Customs were really upset, open it, close it, tried to phone us, well, bank holiday, Good Friday, nobody worked here. So they got a little bit upset, put it back to Frankfurt. Frankfurt opened it, closed it, it's not for us, it's for Canada. Back to Canada. And I think after 2 weeks, we got a very angry telephone call from somebody from the customs. And then it came back. The good thing was the temperature logger worked perfectly fine. So we had all that stuff, and I can tell you now those stories, but we found out it's probably a bit too heavy. And then we came with the idea of silica pearls, and it was much easier without temperature loggers and boxes. But this is really a problem. If you have sensitive goods, how to bring them from place A to place B, especially if you have combination with pharmaceuticals that need a certain level of humidity, should not exceed a certain temperature range and whatever. And you need labels. And labels must be readable. This is not always the case if you look on some labels on bottles or whatever. And they must be in languages, in the major languages where you distribute your goods. Imagine you would have 5 countries. I mean, all the information must be written in 5 languages on the package. Especially if you work in microsystems, your devices are not that huge. So you either have to ship them in really huge packages where you can put all the labels on top, or you have to find a solution where you have a kind of wireless identification tags or QR codes that then refer to database where you can record things. So the labeling is quite often an underestimated challenge with that. Okay, then we have advertisement. Probably not our major issue here in engineering. Very important in medical devices, there is a limitation of advertisement. It's not like if you look in if you compare advertisements in the US with Europe, there are different rules of the game, how you are allowed to advertise. In medical devices, there is a certain limit that you should not create misleading expectations. Because if people are really suffering from a disease, they take whatever they can get. And if you have misleading expectations, you screw up their lives. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because sometimes people phrase certain sentences such that they do not say what they mean, but you can smell it a little bit. So it's written in between the lines, and I think that's not fair. Because people then really think, probably it's not written there, but I'm pretty sure that it might work in my case and whatever. So that's quite often the reason that you do not find enough patients for studies if you develop new devices, because they're so desperate. I remember when I was a postdoc involved in a retina implant project, and our clinicians put out a web page that, well, we are looking for patients who are blind with a certain disease, who might participate in a first implant study in 3 years. And I think there were 500 volunteers after 2 hours. And then you have to sort them out. Who is really eligible for inclusion? What are proper inclusion criteria? What are exclusion criteria? That you do not have persons having too high expectations there or wrong expectations, because they might not be as objective as you like. There's a really nice, now I think already 10 years old, 10 years old probably. Some of you might know that famous German Tatort series, that crime series that was some years ago. One thing about retinal implants, and a patient who predicted to see something because she was afraid that she might get excluded from the study when she does not see anything. So those things can happen. I've had, as advisory board member, the opposite thing in Australia when they performed a study, and all those patients were legally blind. And one patient came after the week and said that, I've read the contract, I have a question to paragraph 2. Okay, you're blind? Yeah, you know, I still have some residual. If I take a magnifying glass and I can still read. So that's important, really, to have those proper criteria where you can include patients and where you have to exclude them if you really are investigating a new device or a new therapy or something like that. So in sale, should be selling good stuff and no crap. And in the use, the whole system should prevent user errors and should monitor intended use versus off-label use. So user errors means by education, so you have in introductions into the thing, you have to check if people have really understood what you've taught them. You have to repeat that on a yearly base, for example, in hospitals. And the thing is always that huge discussion about intended use versus off-label use. And there's a new, well, not a new, but there is another standard around about usability and, forgot the second term, and that usability standard considers the most obvious off-label use. And you, as a developer, have to consider that. And that will mean, for example, if you sell, I take an example that I know, there are electrode arrays for pre-surgical epilepsy monitoring. So persons severely suffering from epileptic seizures can undergo surgery and a piece of the brain is cut out where that seizure onset zone is. So let's say the source of the seizure. That's the idea of today. And since the skull really blurs all the signals that you get, you do first non-invasive monitoring of the signals with an EEG on the surface of the skull, and it's around here. And then the surgeon in a surgical intervention already drills here in the rectangle, takes out the bone, implants an electrode array there, let the cable stick out, put the bone back, closes everything, you get a Band-Aid around, and you're sitting there on a special ward for up to 10 days where you record the patient's brain activity directly from the surface of the brain to localize that seizure onset zone. This is so stressful that in some patients, no seizures occur. So, what should you do? And one option is to poke them a little bit with electrical current. So to stimulate over the implant, and the implants are sold as recording arrays. So that's one of the most obvious non-intended uses. But it's clear, if you talk to them, you know that they will stimulate sooner or later. And even though you sell something as a recording array, you have to test in advance if you can stimulate with that. And what the limits are under which this array is then safe with electrical stimulation. And that's really tricky because you have to be an expert there to see what can people do with that. They're really weird applications. For example, endoscopes are quite often used as trocars. A trocar is a rod where you poke a tunnel between the skin and the underlying muscle tissue. For example, to route a cable of a cardiac pacemaker. And I've seen pictures where people were they did not see the trocar, so they took the endoscope and really poke tunnels somewhere. And this is what you have to check. If you know this might be done, you have to make your devices fail-safe versus those non-intended use And this is really much more than you normally would do. On the other hand, you do it for sure. Otherwise, people would say, I did not do anything. You know that if you break something, wasn't me. Yeah, same in the clinical environment. And then disposal, as I already said, I mean the nuclear cardiac pacemaker is the worst example I can imagine, but they're all what you might know are needles of syringes that might be infected. And I grew up as paramedic where they were still blank, so in, out, oh, should not poke myself, put them in the sharp bin somewhere. Nowadays, this is no longer allowed. You have some coverage mechanisms if you pull out a syringe needle, that there is an adjacent safety cap that you flip around the corner, that the hazard of getting cross-infected from patients is much less. So that would mean all things that are not in the mainstream of your development have to be considered there from legal terms. And if you do something like this, you end up with those nice pictures here of stars or spider webs or whatever, where you have shared responsibility and everybody overtakes a certain part of it. And this can be then bounced back to the different partners. So the manufacturer is the creator of the device, ensures to meet or exceed the standards, and makes the product ready for the market. The vendor can be the same entity as the manufacturer, but is legally separated. Is the, let's say, the interface partner between the product and the user, has to provide after-sales service, like introductions, telephone hotline for complaints and questions, collecting the waste if the products are at the end of life, things like that. And there's something like post-market surveillance, and that means you are responsible as, here, vendor, to look if something goes wrong. Because if you make the most beautiful device of the world and your users are not able to use that and make mistakes, you're legally responsible to report those incidents back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer has to change the product accordingly. Could be, for example, that your power socket that you have to connect your device to whatever, probably to the power socket, also fits to another socket where it's not intended. It was in the 1960s, 70s that ECG electrodes had certain plugs that fitted into the power socket, 220 volts. And people being under stress thought, oh, a power socket, put it into the power socket, and then the babies were at 220 volts and dead. So this is something, probably the device was from a country where the power sockets look differently. If you travel around the world, US power socket look different from Australian ones, look different from UK ones, look different from European ones. So even Switzerland has its own standard. So there are many different things around, and you have to check, is this compliant with each other? As already said, the user is not the patient, very important thing. You have to qualify the user. The user has to be familiar with indications, contraindications, and operating procedures. And the experience that the user gains must be shared with the vendor and the manufacturer. And that means those annual introductions or meetings with the hospital persons or doctors are not only to educate them, but also to collect the feedback there and to improve the device. The patient has not been mentioned so far. The patient is part of the general public who is the ultimate beneficiary of medical devices. And so the general public is then kind of part with the government and the governance over that, that he or she is safe. This runs in different countries better or worse, yeah, depending where you are. Europe is relatively safe. I would say they're crazy in some cases about safety. So that balance of innovation and safety is currently very much on the safety side. While the balance that was on the safety side in the US, for example, is now tilting back to innovation. So it's currently easier to approve a device in the US, do studies there and come back to Europe. Was completely the other way around for the last 20 years. So that changes sometimes, and one has to see what the best is. So how is that done worldwide with respect to regulations? We all have, well, I have seen those phases all over the world. We have a pre-market phase where things are manufactured. Then we have a placing on market phase and that post-market surveillance or vigilance phase. That means here is the check, is the thing really safe? Do people know what they do? This here is the advertisement and sale. And this is the core engineering part, the first three boxes. Different phases have different requirements. So while the safety attributes are the most important things in the pre-market phase, we have more the registration and advertisement and the placing on market phase and the surveillance on the post-market phase. And different countries or regions in the world have different ideas about that. We have the European Union with the CE mark, which is more or less a safety label. Then we have the United States of America, where we have a governmental registration. However, there is a different classification. Research devices are handled differently from things that should be placed on the market for the general public. This differentiation is not present in Europe, for example. We have a system that is more or less in the middle in Australia and Canada. So it's a device license plus some efficacy testing. And we have a different system in Japan, which I did not understand so far, since this seems to be complicated and I'm not able to understand Japanese, so I kept my fingers off there. This is what is written on that table. So I jump over that and want to share some slides that I stole from a speaker from TÜV Süd, one of the major notified bodies in Europe that are responsible for approval of medical devices. And this is one of the points that is currently strongly discussed in Europe. And in the US, for example, the Food and Drug Administration is a legal entity from the government that approves the medical devices. In Europe, that responsibility is passed from the legal entity, the Federal Ministry for Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices, the BfArM, to companies that are then notified bodies. And the question is, can a company be independent enough if a company has to be run by economic aspects, right? Companies have to earn money. So is it a good idea to pass that responsibility from a governmental entity to a company? I don't want to comment on that because I'm still not sure what my own opinion about that is. There are advantages and disadvantages, and the question is, are there really differences? I mean, is there a difference if I have to pay $1,000 to the governmental organization or to private organization? depends how everything is organized and handled and what the management is about. But that's a different story. So how does it work in Europe? We have a regulatory system. We should have a free market, so no customs barriers, and everything should be the same all over Europe. And the patient should be safe. Currently, we have about 27 sovereign states in the EU. Depends how many will enter and how many will leave the European Union. And the former instrument were directives. Directives is a kind of umbrella thing that is valid all over the EU. And the directives then have to be translated into national law. In most cases, you just have one page in front of that and says, this directive is now national law. And this is then the transition, for example. It's a bit stupid, but it can work like that. And of course, it has to be translated into the national language because laws are only valid if they are in the national language. So a bit stupid in the EU where you have so many languages. And then there was a scandal about breast implants in France some years ago, PIP. They used hardware store silicone rubber instead of medical grade rubber. They used medical grade rubber when the notified body came to inspection, and they had a really good system. They knew when they entered the ground floor that they had to change the silicone rubber in the first floor. So I think there was mainly criminal energy there. If you are that good that you really change things on such a base, right? But this was such a large scandal that everything had changed in the EU. And since 2017, there's a new directive launched. No, wrong, that's a regulation now. Medical Device Regulation, MDR. And that means this thing is valid all over Europe without translation in national laws. So it directly acts as the same regulation in all member states. Why do I still have the old thing here on the pages? The reason is that there's still a transition period up to 2020, so 2020 and 2021, where the old laws still apply. And there are so many cool or crazy things in the new regulation that there are still some issues where nobody knows how to implement that. So that means probably the transition from the old into the new system will take another 3-5 years longer than expected because it's more difficult than expected. They are all created by the European Commission. Then they have to be accepted by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, so there's a lot of lobbying around. It takes an awful lot of time to go through, and therefore it always takes many years. Before that regulation stuff, it's a directive. It has to go then into all countries and member states through the whole law system, so it takes another awful lot of time, and then it's accepted. We had 3 directives, one of medical devices, one of active implantable medical devices, and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. This is now in the MDR, the active and the other medical devices. Good thing is you don't have to read 2 of them. Bad thing is the new regulation is longer than the old 2 together. You can download one that has fewer pages, but then everything is printed in 6 dot. So it doesn't make sense. They have come into place in the 1990s. So there's a good reason to transfer them. Just to give you an idea how to read them, if you look them up on the internet, you always find the first number, that's the year, so 1990. Then there's a second number, that's this directive here has been number 385 in the year 1990. And then there's here EEC. In older times, it was the European Economic Commission. Then it was the European Commission. So it just means it's released by the European Union. I would kindly ask you also to have the true name in mind, because it's easier if you say the medical device directive, people know what you're talking about. If you talk about the 93/42/EEC, probably only 10% know what you're talking about, right? Good thing is all those things have similar structures. As said in the beginning, they have definitions, they have inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and then you can go through. They're all very general and don't give you details. That's the downside. And then you have to look for other directives that are complementing that. So it's really like geocaching. You're somehow a bit lost, and then you have to go through the forest and find what you're looking for. The whole idea is a kind of the medical device regulation and the medical device directives is a kind of conformity assessment procedure set. So if you follow certain rules and you are in a quality control system that checks that you follow those rules, you are eligible to proceed. And the notified bodies, as part of the legal authority, check if you follow the rules that you have set up, and if these rules that you set up are in accordance with the underlying laws. That means in some cases you need good arguments if you don't follow a certain pathway to prove that your pathway is better than the one that is written down in a certain ISO standard or something like this. But in general, you can negotiate those things with your notified body. As already said from the beginning, here's again the definition part, and I want to go over that for time reasons and stop here with the active medical device and the active implantable medical device. This is something that is of importance because we are acting in an interdisciplinary environment as biomedical engineers or persons somehow touching that field. In medical device environment, an active medical device is defined as any medical device relying on a source of electrical energy or any source of power other than directly generated by the human body or gravity. So, in simple words, if you have a battery or something that delivers electrical energy over some conversion, which is not the citric acid cycle, then it's an active medical device. This is known by everybody in the field of medical devices. If you go just a step outside of that circle, for example, to our friends from polymer chemistry, and polymers are something that are really beneficial in implants, they would define an active material completely different. And I had that experience on an expert panel years ago where we really got angry and were arguing like crazy, and then it came out close to the lunch break that we are arguing because nobody told us that half of the crowd was biomaterials persons and the other half of the crowd were engineers. And the engineers had that definition in mind, And the biomaterials persons have a different definition of an active device. An active device in their case is a device or a material that has a surface coating that it interacts with enzymes. If you don't talk about that, you can really get angry with your neighbor because you use the same expression or the same term for something different. It's the same if orthopedic surgeons and mathematicians come together and they talk about degrees of freedom or something like that. For mathematicians, it would be clear that you mean something that this is orthogonal, and if you make a cross product, that you get something that is again orthogonal, and if it's coplanar, then it vanishes or whatever. Orthopedic surgeon means with a degree of freedom, a direction in which you can move your joint. So it could be rotation or flexion, extension. So that was another eye-opener I had some years ago. So it's really important in that field to understand the definition of other persons. At least to say, well, if I talk about this, here's my definition. Can we agree on that, or do you have a different definition on that? And the same is true in those definitions of the manufacturer. And here that means the natural or legal person. Legal person means you have to point a person in a company or organization who is eligible for sign things, and then this person goes into prison and not somebody else. Design, manufacturing, packaging, and labeling of a device before it is placed on the market under his own name. And this is the key sentence that's explained here. And regardless of these operations are carried out by the person himself or on his behalf by a third party. This has changed in the new medical device regulation. There, this responsibility can be traced back. And that's really tough for startup companies. If you are a startup company with, let's say, 10 employees or whatever, and you buy screws or cables from the world market leader of those devices, having probably 10,000 employees and a multi-billion turnover, and then you show up and said, I want now to audit you. The law says I'm eligible to audit you. And then you come up with your one quality management person there and want to audit, let's say, BASF or Novartis. And I'm pretty sure they're not that pleased if you show up and want to look into their books and into their documentation and whatever. So that's the law, but you really have to be careful how to handle that. But this is really important, that liability issue, who is responsible for that, and how can I ensure that I share that responsibility on one hand, or to document that I did everything such that I cannot be sued. And one of those fuzzy technical terms is the term of essential requirements. In German, grundlegende Anforderungen. So these essential requirements is a set of measures that you have to take to prove that your device is safe. So first of all, they are listed, and then you have to find them. Where are the essential requirements in my law text? Mainly at the end, in the annexes. And there are general requirements and special requirements, and you have to check where you can go through. This is a kind of flow chart in some cases. And there's a number, so I have to jump to that paragraph. I have to jump back, go to the next paragraph. That's really expert knowledge. And you find formulations like that. Packaging is able to protect the device during storage and transport. Sure, but it does not tell you how. And then you have to know or find out that there is a certain international standard that gives you measures how to verify the protection during packaging and storage. So normally quality management persons who do this are a bit different. Because if you do that every day, 8 hours a day, your mindset changes a little bit. So you're no longer that flexible then at the very end. And this is really a long list. A lot of things can be done on literature base. So to prove that your thing is on the state of the art means you have to provide a literature review, you have to provide a standard review, that you are in there, and a lot of other things that you really make a thick book to assess everything. At the very end, you have to include clinical data, and that's the tricky part. If you do something brand new, there are no clinical data around, and that means you have to perform a clinical trial to obtain data that you can provide to the legal authority for approval. And then there are a lot of annexes that tell you what to do. The very important thing for an engineer, probably starting as design or developmental engineer, is to keep in mind that you have to document everything from the very first day on. And that is also documenting of decisions. Why do you decide to make 3 holes into that system and not 5 holes? And who was participating in the discussion in which you made those decisions? It's not about writing long novels about that, but really short and concise, probably having a form, minutes of today's meeting. We decided that 3 holes are good due to mechanical determination with 3-point fixation. Yeah, if you have 3 points, everything is mechanical determined. Having a sentence like that, and then one writes down the names who have discussed that, then you're on the safe side and you can include that. If you forget about that and you develop there, playing around, trying out this and this and that for 2 years, and you come up with something that looks beautiful and works well, and then the head of quality management said, yeah, where's your design dossier? What do you mean? And then you can really start from the scratch with that. It's also as important to look into standards. I've seen it once, that a research institute really developed a cool thing. So it was 20 years ago, flexible electronics were just there about to change the world. And they did on a flexible foil with some adhesive electrodes, a flexible wireless monitor to record the heart signals. And they did not look into the standard about distances between lines carrying voltages. And they were 3 millimeters too narrow. That means they could start from the scratch redeveloping their printed circuit board because they did not check the standard first. And that means if you start being really green in that field, being completely naive, it's probably good to ask some senior persons or good consultants, so persons who can tell you something while burning your money. Then it's really important to take you some advice, because otherwise you get crazy if you have to find that out by your own. That's something that takes ages. That's here all with that full quality management system, including that design dossier. That means you have set up kind of standard operating procedure, textbook. How do I do things? What do I do? That sounds a bit crazy for research, but it's really advantages also in some aspects of research. If you have all your devices calibrated, for example, with a good maintenance, then you can do really beautiful research and you can trust your data. If you don't have that, then it might get fishy from time to time when you work on devices and machines that have not been calibrated or maintained for the last 10 years and you never know why they work or why they don't work. So it's a kind of balance to make it as lean as possible in research and in startup companies. Well, it's really important if you have huge companies like Novartis, like Siemens, General Electric, whatever, those dinosaurs. They're a little bit slow in movements, but they're so huge that's really important to be able to track everything back through the whole company then. And there are other options. If you say, I don't do so many very small series, you can do a type examination that you produce something for 4, 5, 6 times, and then one of those devices is brought to testing laboratory, and the notified body plays around and make it explode or something like that to see if it works according to the rules. If you don't do that type examination or type verification and you have that quality management system, it's also necessary to have statistical testing, and statistical testing always means that you need numbers. Yeah, and this is sometimes under-expected. We did research here and went into a human being, and therefore we had to do some statistical testing of devices before, and we needed at the very end 4 devices. So we thought if we have 8 available in the operation room, that's probably good. So 1 spare part for every device. But we started with more than 120 devices the final testing round. That means we probably also already destroyed 200, 300 before, but the final tests were with about 120, 130. And that means even in research, if you want to go into humans, you might set up a small series manufacturing line to be able to meet all the requirements. That's sometimes underestimated if you look on 1 or 2 or 3 human clinical trials at the very end. This is set up here, can either go through the quality management system on that way or through the type examination, which is good if you have fewer devices, but if you want to set up a manufacturing line, then it's more adequate to have that quality management system where everything is described well in standard operating procedures. Another technical term you will see is that conformity assessment procedure, or CAP, that you have to set up to verify what you have promised. The Medical Device Directive, and this is also true for the MDR, so the Medical Device Regulation. They are a kind of the umbrella law around, and if you want to set up a quality management system, especially for implants, so things that need a higher level of safety, you have to follow that 13485 quality management of medical devices standard, which is a standalone standard. So that is, let's say, the alternative or the one and only standard that you have to use. So ISO 9000 is already included there. So what's ISO 9000? That quality management system that you also might have at your hairdressers or in a grocery store or whatever, that monitors quality and defines quality and stuff like this, is here is focused on medical devices only as 13485. So this is a little bit text about conformity assessment. So you need a technical file, and such a technical file can be easily just the description, let's say 600 pages, and if you do it paper-based, your arm span on a shelf is the amount of folders you can expect for a product of middle complexity. So it's really something that is not done just aside. And if you talk to developers, they say in the meantime you have about 70 to 80% of documentation over the lifespan of a product that you need before you're able to manufacture that. So that means it's sometimes it sounds a bit overrated. On the other hand, it's very important to keep that high level of safety, but it means you should learn about that very early on if you want to launch something on the market. And there are a lot of small companies that were not that deeply involved in that quality management system in the recent part of the directives, and that are now suffering a lot because things have come stronger and everybody has to document now with that new medical device regulation. So if you look for something that looks promising in the future, quality management of medical devices might be a good cash cow to earn a lot of money if you can make friends with law techs. If not, you're probably not the right person for quality assurance and regulatory affairs. Yes, a question in the back.
Yeah, well, I have one question. For me, it sounds a bit like it's so complicated it becomes even huger that can it also might be like protect the market in the EU? Like when you look in the States and the EU and Japan is selling this and that.
Yeah, it's also, sometimes this discussion arises if this complexity protects the market. I'm still hesitant if I should agree on that. I mean, it really protects knowledge of those companies who know to do that. That's true. On the other hand, our expectations, and I mean really each and everybody of us grew over the years towards technical products. So the first cardiac pacemakers that have been sold, that have been implanted in patients survived, well, the first one survived half a day and then it was broken. The later ones survived half a year. And now cardiac pacemakers survive 5 to 10 years depending on the battery capacity. I can remember when I was a kid, hip implants were implanted in patients that were older than 65, better older than 70 years because their life expectancy was 75. That means implant lifetime was predicted to 5 years. Nowadays, people get implanted when they are 40, 45 because of extreme sports or sports careers in their youth, and they all expect an implant lifetime of 20, 25 years. So our expectations have been risen, and meeting those expectations and having, let's say, better, more reliable products also means more testing. It's the same with cars. My car has now 210,000 kilometers and I still expect the car to live for another 5 years. I remember my first car when it was above 80,000 was already very shaky and broke down at 120, 130. So only being 25, 30 years older than that. So we have different expectations, and this is the balance. I mean, we can go back with less documentation, less testing, whatever, but then we have to be very aware that we buy this by less reliability or less variability. You know, if you have only 3 products, yeah, like the 4T model, you can have it in any color unless it's black, yeah. So you have no choice. Then you can reduce the complexity of documentation and things like that. On the other hand, we're currently talking about patient individualized medicine, and that will mean we probably have to change the whole the whole verification and validation system such that we have a different set of essential requirements that we define, and we have to derive tests from those essential requirements that are really device or application specific. That's one thing. The other thing is that, and this is something that's not that fashion nowadays, we have really to start discussion if everybody needs a high-end device. Every patient in every country. Yeah? If a device costs 70,000 euros or US dollars, it doesn't matter, and patients cannot afford that, how to handle that? Should we probably have class B device that costs 1,000 bucks, is not as sophisticated, but helps you to increase your quality of life? And this is something that's beyond the technical stuff, that's really goes into basic societal questions and how we want to live and where we want to spend the money for. And this is something where engineers should tap in. I think it's not good that there are only law persons and philosophers who are participating in those discussions, but I think it's mandatory that engineers with technical knowledge and communication skills also enter there to help exchange arguments there and come to solutions in different societies with different levels of income and have a kind of vision for a healthcare system. And it can be that we have then devices that have less documentation, less performance, but it's better to have a cheap one that helps a bit than to have nothing, right? And this is something where we all have to where we have to strongly discuss on really what our vision of healthcare and devices and so on is. That's independent from research. I think what can be researched will be researched, and then it's, in my opinion, good to have certain boundary conditions and certain societal control that we should communicate on that we don't do something in an ivory tower and then sell it to whomever who pays most of that. But this is also point of discussion and philosophy, what research should do and how to transfer research into something that's beneficial for society. That's good that you had that question, so it goes beyond the technical thing, but I think that's very important to keep it in mind and also have those ethical and societal aspects in mind when we talk about applications there. This is something where you can read over it. Keep it in mind, certificates do expire. Certificates normally expire on a 5 years base. But you have to do annual audits. That means every year your beloved notified body shows up and checks if you still know what your quality management system is about. And that is not only fun. So they're really good in finding your weak points in the system to help you to improve and be safe. I want to speed up a little bit. What is harder in the medical device regulation is the post-market surveillance and the vigilance system. So the question, what happens with my stuff on the market? And am I really serious about finding out if there are weak points? There have been some scandals also on hip implants where the dispute is still going on. Was it a lousy implant? Or was it a stupid surgeon who implanted that? And so the company says you need 5 strikes of a hammer to implant the prosthesis, and the surgeon said, below 7 strikes you cannot do that. And then the question was, is 7 strikes too much because the company said 5? Right? So the company said, we said 5. If you don't take it with 5, we are out. And the surgeon said, it will never work with 5. You always need 7 or 8. And if you now be in the best of all worlds, you would have said, well, company and surgeons sit together and find out either if the 5 is wrong or if the 7 is wrong, and to change the whole procedure in a way that both sides are happy and the patients can benefit. And this is what the new medical device regulation tries to force now, that this reporting duties are enforced. The bad thing is that it will make more work. So you have to report that, and you should perform a risk analysis of your results each and every year. And that is quite a challenge for companies who sell, let's say, 5,000 devices a year, to get reports from 5,000 devices, sit together in a multidisciplinary team and find out, should I change something? What should I change? Is it on the product? Is it on the education of the users? Stuff like that. But I think it's will be an overshoot, and then it will hopefully level out at a reasonable degree of complexity. So with that, I'm at the end. At least 3 weeks before this lecture, this was the actual medical device regulation of the World Health Organization. You find the MDR and these devices here also on the internet for free. You don't have to download them, but if you need them in the future, just check the internet and you find them for free on the European pages. With that, I'd like to cook down all the slides to some take-home messages that medical devices have to fulfill defined specs with respect to safety, effectiveness, and quality. That's all about in the laws. The approval procedure accompanies the whole life cycle of a medical device, and there are always feedback loops from each and every step to each and every step. And I guess, or I believe, if you know the fundamentals or the ideas of that, it helps you a lot to get through whatever legal system you're entering. So it's more about the mindset. If you have that mindset, it helps you to find out, to ask the right questions, no matter if you are in the US system or in the European system or in the Australian one, and find the right places and persons that help you to get the details and come through. And with that, I'm at the very end. Thank you very much, and promise you that we will close that legal part with that lecture and enter the technological parts from next lecture on. Thank you very much.